All right, I know what you're thinking. Pastor Kevin wasn't here to read the gospel, so it's got to be a long sermon today. So I see you starting to try to get comfortable and doze off. I do have a microphone I can throw at you. I'll try to keep you awake. Connie Neal, in her book, The Gospel According to Harry Potter, writes the following. A magnifying glass does a fine job if you use it to examine something in detail. It is designed to exaggerate small areas and magnify that small part for closer consideration. However, if you lift up a magnifying glass and try to view the entire landscape or room, the entire image flips upside down. Neal's words ring truer than ever when it comes to reading the Bible, and particularly our biblical text this morning from the Gospel of Luke. I mean, if you look through this text in a magnifying glass, you're going to see a couple of interesting things. You're going to find some very interesting words about what it means to spread the kingdom of God. You're going to find some very terrifying words about what it means to be a disciple. And we'll get to those things in a minute, but we need to be careful of something, because if you keep looking at the magnifying glass and try to understand Christianity as you look at those texts through the magnifying glass, you're going to turn things upside down and come away with a very warped view. So we're going to try to avoid that this morning. So hopefully I've whetted your appetite a little bit with those opening comments. And so now let's turn to this text. Let's see how it all comes together and see how it applies to our lives as we seek to be, to live as, and to make disciples of Jesus. So let's pick up the magnifying glass. Let's look at these texts. These 12 verses can actually be broken up into two separate teachings. You could really preach two separate sermons on these texts. That's why the sermon's a little bit long today. The first is a teaching about how the kingdom of God is to be spread. The second is a teaching about the cost of discipleship. And both of these things are actually really, really important for the church today. And so I'm going to try to give them a little bit of addressing. Take just a little bit longer than normal, but they're very, very, very important. So let's look at the text. At first, we are told that Jesus resolutely sets his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, most biblical scholars see this as a turning point in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is shifting his attention from his teaching, from his healing, from the revealing of the kingdom of God ministry, and he is setting his face onto the journey towards the cross. And as Jesus turns to head to the cross, he sends messengers out ahead to prepare the way. Now, this is like back in the day when kings would travel around the countryside. The king would always send a herald ahead into the nearing towns and villages to give these towns and villages a chance to get ready for the king's arrival. So this is what Jesus is doing, and he sends his messengers into a Samaritan village that is right ahead. They tell everyone that Jesus is coming, but in a stunning turn of events, that village rejects Jesus completely and totally because he had his face turned to Jerusalem. Now, to put this in proper perspective, we need to remember a couple of things. First, in the ancient world, hospitality was a huge deal. It was expected that you would welcome travelers into your home or village and take care of them. To fail to offer Jesus this hospitality was a refusal of an important societal expectation. So that's the first thing that they would run into. Secondly, this would be a slap in the face of someone who was considered really important. So let me ask you this question. Do you think Jesus is important? Yes. Of course. And Luke in the chapter 9 really shows us how important Jesus is. Because in Luke chapter 9, it's chock full of all of these things that Jesus did to show that he is the Messiah, God come to earth. First, you have the feeding of the 5,000. Then you have Peter declaring that Jesus is the Messiah. Then you have Jesus taking Peter, James, and John up on the mountain, and he is changed and revealed in his heavenly glory in something we call the Transfiguration. And then they come down off the mountain, and Jesus cures a demon-possessed boy that no one had been able to cure. So in all of these things, Jesus has revealed himself as a man of tremendous importance, as the Messiah. And the Messiah should be treated with the utmost of respect. Except that village didn't. You see, the best example that I could come up with in comparison is to think that, what if one day the President of the United States called up Bethany and said that he wanted to come worship with us? Now, remember, no matter what you feel about the President, it is still an honor to have the leader of the country want to worship with you. And second, who do we want to worship with us? Who do we want to worship with us?
Everyone.
Everyone, right? Our doors are open. I mean, if the entire town of Fredericksburg came and to worship with us on a Sunday, we would rejoice, right? Because we want everyone to be able to hear the gospel. So if we were to reject the president and we were to say, sorry, we don't want you here, we would be slapping the president in the face, metaphorically speaking. And also, we would be failing to adhere to our own principles of welcome. So both of these things would amount to a huge insult of monumental proportions. You see, that's why James and John get angry. That's why Jesus' disciples get angry. They'd seen Jesus revealed in his glory. They heard that he was the Messiah. They saw him feed the 5,000. They saw him cast out the demons. They saw him do all these things. This is a very important person. And this village is slapping Jesus in the face. They are violating the community norms of hospitality. This is the lowest of the low. And so James and John say, hey, Jesus, can we bring down fire and brimstone from heaven to punish these Samaritans? And of course Jesus says, nah, no. But see, you got to understand, Jesus doesn't just say no. I mean, there's a very, very strong condemnation in the Greek. Jesus rebukes James and John. And you need to know that the Greek word that is used here is the same word that Jesus uses to rebuke the demons. And so, the Greek leaves little doubt that James and John's thoughts here are demonic. And I think that's a clear lesson for us. If Jesus meant his kingdom to be spread by fear and violence, he would have allowed James and John to call down fire and brimstone. However, the kingdom of God is not to be spread by such methods. The kingdom of God is not to be spread by fear or hatred or anger. The kingdom of God is meant to be spread by sharing the love and mercy of God. Jesus is heading to Jerusalem to die for the world, to save the world, to show God's great love to the world, not to condemn the world. Which I think leaves us in the church with a couple of questions. The first one is, how willing are we to condemn the world? And then the second is, how often are we willing to die for the world? To lay down our lives to show the love of God to the world? I could preach a whole sermon on that. I could. But then I'd be leaving out part of the other text that we have before us in our gospel, so we need to turn to that. This time we have some very important things to consider about discipleship. We need to now deal with 3 separate incidents that happen as Jesus is journeying towards Jerusalem. All 3 of those incidents have to do with discipleship, or what it means to follow Jesus. First, a person comes up to Jesus and says, I will follow you wherever you go. Now, on the surface, this does not sound like a bad statement. It sounds like a statement of determination. It sounds like a statement of faith and trust. It sounds like a statement of excitement and exuberance. But Jesus sees that it is also a statement of ignorance, a statement spoken by someone who hasn't quite thought through what they are saying. And so Jesus says, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. In other words, I appreciate that you want to follow me, but here's the reality of my life. It's not a life of comfort. I don't live in palaces and mansions. I don't have the creature comforts in my life. And what is more, the journey that I'm taking is taking me to a cross. You see, Jesus had already said earlier in Luke chapter 9, whoever wants to be my disciple must take up his cross daily and follow me. Do you think those are words of comfort? Yes or no? Have I put you to sleep? They're not words of comfort. They're not words of ease and leisure. They're tough words. They are words meant to make us measure the cost of discipleship. They are words meant to make us take seriously the question that I heard in the sermon that I listened to this week on this text. And the question is this: are we going to choose comfort or the cross? Jesus looks each of us squarely in the eye and he asks us this question: do you want a life of comfort? Do you want a life of ease? Do you want a life of leisure and fun? If so, don't commit your life to me. Following me is not easy. You know what? That sounds pretty bad. It almost makes you want to rethink being a Christian. But it gets worse. Because this time Jesus goes up to a man and he says, follow me. The guy wants to go, but he responds to Jesus with these words: Lord, first let me go and bury my father. Now, scholars have debated this request. Some think that dad is still alive and that the son is essentially saying, let me wait until my father is dead, let me receive my inheritance, and then I will follow you. That's the scholars on one hand. Scholars on the other hand say that the dad is dead, and the son is looking to perform his expected duties, to honor his father by giving him a proper burial. But either of those cases, in either scenario, Jesus is having none of it. Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go proclaim the kingdom of God. Now, we don't know exactly what Jesus meant by let the dead bury their own dead. It could be let the spiritually dead bury the real dead. We don't know for sure. But honestly, that's not the important part of that statement. That's not the important focus. We need to focus on the fact that Jesus is telling us there is no greater obligation than proclaiming the kingdom of God. There is no obligation that is greater than following Jesus. There is nothing that should stand in your way of worship, of charity, or of telling others about Jesus. In other words, don't make excuses. Don't make excuses about fearing that your friends or family will reject you. Don't make excuses like folks might get angry with you. Don't make excuses like you have family coming into town. Don't make excuses like there's a sports tournament scheduled. These obligations pale in comparison to the mission of spreading the gospel. Again, as a pastor asked in the sermon, are we going to settle for maintenance or are we going to sacrifice for mission? A disciple does not settle for maintenance. A disciple always sacrifices for mission. A disciple always puts Jesus first. Jesus is not an add-on. He's not an accessory in a Christian's life. He is the Christian's life. Period. That's just number 2. Do you really want to go to number 3 now? Another fellow comes up to Jesus and says, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Again, this seems like a reasonable request. I mean, given what Jesus has said, if this guy follows Jesus, he might not get to see his family again. He wants to tell them goodbye before he heads out. But Jesus rejects this line of thinking. He says, no one who puts a hand in the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Now, this saying seems kind of obsolete for many of us who know about agriculture these days. Because we know you can get in a tractor, you can program your GPS, and the tractor will plow the rows for you, and you can look back or sleep while it's doing that. So we need to come up with a little bit of a better illustration in order to understand what Jesus says here. So let's think about it this way. No one drives down the highway while turning and looking back behind them. Take your eyes off the road, you go crooked. You're liable to end up in the ditch. So for us, the question again is, will our lives be marked by indecisive minds or undivided hearts? Will we keep Jesus as our sole and only focus? Will we live for Him and Him alone? Will we have other loyalties? Will our hearts be divided? Or will our hearts be consumed with Jesus? Man, these are tough questions. These teachings hold our feet to the fire. How many of you feel like you got your toes stepped on this morning a little bit? Anybody? You're just not willing to admit it? Am I the only one raising my hand up here? Because I tell you what, Jesus is stepping on my toes, and He's not just stepping on them, but He's stomping on them. Let me tell you, my toes hurt. And I don't think they would stop hurting if these teachings were the sum and substance of Christianity. If Christianity meant that we were required to do these things and never waver, I think we would all be in trouble. In fact, the skeptics, those outside of our churches, look at us, they look at these teachings, and they say, you either can't or you won't even follow what Jesus says to do here. How can you call yourself a Christian? And so let me ask you a question. Can we be real here for just a minute? Can we be real with one another? And we'll be honest. And I want you to know I'm not talking down my nose at you, because I'm in the same boat with you when I say this. I really don't think any one of us are willing to pay the price to be a Christian. Is that statement the truth? I don't think any of us are really willing to pay the cost to be a disciple. I mean, you just saw what Jesus demanded. It's too high. What we just saw Jesus demand is beyond the strength of any single one of us. And so it begs the question, if this is what Christianity is about, then why would anyone want to be a Christian? If this is what Christianity demands, why would even anyone attempt it? If this is what Christianity is about, why even bother? And to answer that, we need to get rid of the magnifying glass. The magnifying glass has shown us the details, but if we try to look at the whole of Christianity through that magnifying glass, it will turn Christianity upside down. We will not see the landscape right. Because you got to understand something. Christianity is not primarily about what we do. Christianity is not primarily about us. Christianity does not see us as its focus. And that is so important to remember. So if there is anything that you take home with you today from this sermon, make sure it is this. Christianity isn't primarily about what we do, but it is about what God has done in Jesus Christ. We aren't the focus. Jesus is. Because it was Jesus who remained laser focused on His mission from the Father. He did not get distracted by the things of this world. It was Jesus who had no divided loyalties. He looked ahead to the fulfilling of His mission as He headed to the cross. It was Jesus who lived a life of discomfort, who accepted rejection and hatred and poverty, and who ultimately walked straight into suffering and death. It was Jesus who refused to rain down fire and brimstone in punishment upon those who failed and rejected Him. Instead, He took that very fire and brimstone and punishment Himself as He died. As He died for sinners. As He died for the people on the cross. And this is why Christianity isn't about us. Because we fail to be what we're supposed to be. We continue to fail to be the people that God has called us to be. And I'm about to drop the S word here. We're sinners. But we are redeemed sinners. For some reason that is almost too amazing to comprehend. God decided that He wanted to save us. God decided that He wanted to redeem us. And He took on human flesh as Jesus of Nazareth to live the life that we were supposed to live and to die the death that we deserved. And upon dying the death that we deserved, He took upon Himself our uncleanness, our sinfulness, our inability to follow Him as we should. And then He gave to us His righteousness. He gave to us His perfection. He gave to us His glory. If you think about that, it's enough to blow your mind. It's enough to make you truly scratch your head in bewilderment and think, did he really do that for me? And the answer is yes. Yes, he did. He did that for you. He did that for me. He did that for the world. And it's free. Freely given to you, to me, and to the world. It is undeserved. It is unearned. Completely paid for by the blood of the Lamb. So the question becomes, do you trust in what Jesus has done for you? Do you trust in his work and not your own? Do you trust in his amazing grace? If you say yes, let me give you a word of warning. Because when you start trusting in Jesus instead of yourself, when you start focusing on what Jesus has done instead of what you are supposed to do, when you are captured by his amazing grace, then you will find yourself all of a sudden willing to pay the cost of discipleship. You will find yourself being transformed and changed. You will find yourself centering your life on Jesus and living for him. You will no longer be looking through the magnifying glass at Christianity. You will only be looking at Jesus. And maybe, just maybe, that's not such a bad thing after all, is it? Amen.
We hope you have been blessed by this presentation from Bethany Lutheran Church in Fredericksburg. We invite you to worship with us on Sunday mornings at 8, 10:25, or 10:30 a.m. Please like, share, and subscribe this video so that you can help spread the good news of Jesus Christ.